The fluorescent lights in the school hallway cast the same sickly yellow glow they had 15 years ago, but Jennifer Morrison couldn't trust even that simple observation anymore. Memory, she had learned, was a liar dressed in the clothes of truth. She stood outside the principal's office, her fingers tracing the worn edges of a manila folder that contained everything and nothing: newspaper clippings, medical records, school incident reports that read like obituaries for her son's childhood. The folder was her anchor, her proof that what happened here mattered, even if the details kept shifting like sand in an hourglass turned upside down. The name plate on the door read Principal M. Sullivan, but Jennifer's mind superimposed another name, one that made her stomach clench with a mixture of rage and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Through the frosted glass, she could see a figure moving behind the desk. Tall, deliberate, the same careful movement she remembered from before, when everything had been different, when Michael had still been. Focus, Jennifer. Remember why you're here. But that was the problem, wasn't it? She could no longer distinguish between remembering and reimagining, between what had happened and what she needed to have happened. The therapist Dr. Brennan had warned her about this during their sessions, before Jennifer had stopped going, before she had decided that healing meant forgetting, and forgetting felt like betrayal. The door opened before she could knock. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been expecting you." The voice was exactly as she remembered it, warm, authoritative, tinged with an accent that spoke of childhood summers in Ireland. But the face was wrong. Older, yes, but wrong in ways that made Jennifer's carefully constructed timeline of events wobble like a house of cards in a strong wind. Principal Sullivan stepped aside, gesturing for Jennifer to enter. The office smelled of coffee and paper, institutional carpet, and something else, something that triggered a memory so vivid it made her knees weak. Chocolate. The cheap kind from Halloween candy, the kind Michael used to hoard in his desk drawer, counting and recounting the pieces in a ritual that had once seemed endearing and now felt like a monument to all the small joys that had been stolen from him. "Please, sit." Jennifer remained standing, clutching the folder. "You know why I'm here." "I think I do. But I'd like you to tell me anyway." The fluorescent light flickered, and for a moment, Jennifer saw the room as it had been 15 years ago, smaller, shabbier, with a different desk and different diplomas on the wall. In that flickering instant, she saw Michael sitting in the corner chair, his legs swinging because they didn't quite reach the floor, his hands flapping in the subtle, unconscious way that marked him as different to anyone who cared to notice. Stimmying, the specialist had called it, a self-soothing behavior common in autistic children. Jennifer had learned to love those small movements, had seen them as Michael's way of conducting an invisible orchestra only he could hear. But the other children, and some of the teachers, had seen only weirdness, only something to mock and eliminate. "My son," Jennifer began, then stopped. The words felt inadequate, insufficient to carry the weight of everything that had been lost. "My son Michael. He went to school here. He was autistic," Principal Sullivan finished gently. "Yes, I remember." Remember. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jennifer studied the principal's face, searching for some sign of deception, some crack in the composed exterior that would reveal the truth she had spent so many years trying to piece together. "You remember," Jennifer repeated slowly. "But you weren't the principal then. I would have remembered you." Something flickered across Sullivan's features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Memory is a complicated thing, Mrs. Morrison. Sometimes we remember what we need to remember rather than what actually happened." The folder in Jennifer's hands felt suddenly heavy, as if it contained not just papers, but the accumulated weight of years spent questioning everything she thought she knew. She set it down on the desk with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the small room. "I have documentation," she said. "Incident reports. Medical records. A newspaper article about what happened to Michael." Principal Sullivan nodded, but made no move to open the folder. "What do the documents say?" Jennifer's throat tightened. She had read those papers so many times that she could recite them from memory, but each reading revealed new inconsistencies, new details that didn't quite align with her recollections. The dates were wrong, or the names were spelled differently, or the descriptions of events seemed to have been written by someone who had witnessed an entirely different tragedy. They say that Michael was bullied severely, that the school did nothing to protect him. That one day, it became too much, and Jennifer's voice broke. Even now, after all these years, she couldn't say the words aloud. And you blame the school. You blame the administration for failing to keep him safe. Yes. The word came out as a whisper. Principal Sullivan moved to the window, hands clasped behind her back in a posture that was achingly familiar. Outside, children played in the schoolyard, their voices a distant counterpoint to the conversation unfolding in the quiet office. Tell me about the day it happened, Mrs. Morrison. Not what the documents say. What you remember. Jennifer closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back there, standing in this same office 15 years ago, facing a different principal, or was it the same principal with a different name? The memories were like photographs that had been stored in a damp basement, the details blurred and water-stained beyond recognition. October 15, 2009. The call had come during Jennifer's lunch break at work. She remembered the exact moment because she had been eating a turkey sandwich and reading an article about autism spectrum disorders in a medical journal, part of her ongoing effort to understand her son better. To find some key that would unlock the mystery of how to help him navigate a world that seemed designed for neurotypical children. Mrs. Morrison? This is Mrs. Campbell from Riverside Elementary. We need you to come to the school immediately. There's been an incident with Michael. Incident. Such a careful, clinical word. It suggested something minor, manageable, a scraped knee, perhaps, or a disagreement with a classmate. But the tone of the secretary's voice had carried an undercurrent of urgency that made Jennifer's sandwich taste like cardboard in her mouth. She had driven to the school in a state of controlled panic, her mind cycling through possibilities. Michael had been having a difficult time lately. The transition to 5th grade had been harder than expected, and the social dynamics of elementary school seemed to grow more complex and cruel with each passing year. Other children sensed his difference the way predators sensed weakness, and Michael, for all his intelligence and creativity, lacked the social armor that might have protected him. The school building had looked different that day, smaller, somehow, and shabbier than she remembered. Or perhaps that was just how tragedy made everything appear, diminished, inadequate to contain the enormity of what was happening within its walls. Jennifer had found herself standing outside the principal's office, just as she was standing now, holding a folder. Though that first folder had contained Michael's IEP documents and the carefully documented list of accommodations he needed to succeed in a mainstream classroom. She had been prepared for a meeting about academic supports or behavioral interventions. She had not been prepared for what she found inside. Michael had been sitting in the corner chair, his legs drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped around his knees in a position that made him look younger than his 10 years. His face had been streaked with tears, and there was a bruise on his left cheek that Jennifer had not seen that morning when she kissed him goodbye. What happened? She had demanded, and Principal Campbell, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes, had launched into an explanation that had made no sense at the time and made even less sense now, filtered through the distorting lens of memory and trauma. Something about a misunderstanding in the cafeteria. Something about other children playing too roughly. Something about Michael overreacting, as he sometimes did when his routines were disrupted or when sensory input became overwhelming. But the bruise on his face told a different story, and the way Michael had flinched when Jennifer reached for him suggested that whatever had happened was neither minor nor accidental. The other children involved have been spoken to, Principal Campbell had assured her. We take all incidents seriously, Mrs. Morrison. But you have to understand that Michael can be challenging. His behaviors sometimes provoke reactions from his peers. Challenging. Another careful word. One that placed the blame squarely on Michael's shoulders while absolving everyone else of responsibility. Jennifer had heard it before, would hear it again in the weeks that followed, as incidents escalated and the school's responses became increasingly inadequate. But that was the version of events from 15 years ago, filtered through anger and grief and the terrible clarity that comes with hindsight. Now, standing in what might have been the same office with what might have been the same principal, Jennifer found herself questioning everything she thought she remembered about that day. Had there really been a bruise on Michael's face? Had Principal Campbell really been so dismissive? Or had Jennifer's memory transformed a difficult situation into something more sinister, adding details that supported the narrative of institutional failure she had constructed over the intervening years? Mrs. Morrison? Principal Sullivan's voice pulled Jennifer back to the present. You were telling me about the day it happened. Jennifer opened her eyes, disoriented by the transition from memory to reality. The office looked different now, brighter, perhaps. Or maybe that was just the effect of afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that she was certain had been smaller in her recollection. I was remembering the first incident, she said slowly. But that wasn't the day it happened. That was just the beginning. Principal Sullivan returned to her desk, settling into the chair with the easy familiarity of someone who had occupied that space for years. But something about the movement triggered another memory, or pseudo-memory, of sitting across from a different administrator, having a similar conversation about Michael's needs and the school's obligations. Tell me about the beginning, then. The thing about trauma, Jennifer had learned, was that it rarely announced itself with dramatic flourishes. Instead, it accumulated like sediment in still water, layer upon layer of small cruelties and casual indifferences that eventually hardened into something impermeable and permanent. After that first incident in the cafeteria, the one with the bruise that might or might not have existed, Jennifer had become hyper-vigilant about Michael's school experience. She had volunteered for field trips and lunch duty, had made herself a familiar presence in the hallways and classrooms, hoping that her visibility would serve as a deterrent to whatever forces seemed determined to make her son's life miserable. But surveillance, she discovered, was a double-edged sword. The more she watched, the more she saw, and what she saw broke her heart in ways she hadn't known were possible. She watched Michael eat lunch alone, day after day, while other children formed their tribal clusters around tables that might as well have been surrounded by invisible barriers. She watched him approach groups of his peers with the hopeful desperation of someone who had not yet learned that some doors would never open, only to be rebuffed with the casual cruelty that children wielded like a weapon they didn't realize was sharp. She watched teachers grow frustrated with his need for routine, his difficulty with transitions, his literal interpretation of instructions that were meant to be understood intuitively. She watched them try to accommodate his differences while simultaneously communicating, through body language and tone of voice, that his presence was an inconvenience, a disruption to the smooth functioning of their classrooms. And she watched the other children learn to see Michael as she saw him, as different, as other, as somehow less deserving of the basic kindness that human beings owed one another simply by virtue of sharing the same space. The incidents multiplied. Michael's backpack went missing, turning up later in a trash can with his carefully organized school supplies scattered and broken. His homework disappeared from his desk, reappearing days later with crude drawings scrawled in the margins. Other children began to mimic his stymieing behaviors, turning his self-soothing gestures into objects of ridicule. Each time, Jennifer reported the incident to the school. Each time, she was told that children would be children, that Michael needed to develop thicker skin, that perhaps he would benefit from learning to be more flexible in his expectations and responses. The world isn't going to accommodate his differences forever, one teacher had told her during a parent conference. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is help him learn to adapt. But adaptation, Jennifer had realized, was just another word for erasure. The message was clear. Michael could be accepted, but only if he learned to hide the parts of himself that made others uncomfortable. Only if he became someone else entirely. The irony was that Michael was trying to adapt. He had always been a people pleaser, desperate for approval and connection. He followed the rules obsessively, completed his assignments with meticulous attention to detail, and tried to participate in class discussions despite his difficulty with social cues. But none of it seemed to matter. His efforts were either invisible or, worse, seen as evidence of his fundamental otherness. Jennifer had documented everything, creating a paper trail that she hoped would force the school to take action. Incident reports, emails, photographs of damaged belongings. All of it carefully organized in folders that grew thicker as the school year progressed. But documentation, she learned, was not the same as accountability. The school had policies about bullying, had procedures for addressing harassment, had mission statements that spoke eloquently about creating inclusive environments for all students. What they didn't have was the will to apply those policies when doing so would require acknowledging that the problem was systemic rather than individual. Michael needs to learn to advocate for himself, Principal Campbell had told her during one of their increasingly frequent meetings. We can't protect him from every difficult social interaction. That wouldn't be doing him any favors. Jennifer had wanted to scream. Michael was 10 years old, autistic, and being systematically targeted by his peers. The idea that he should be responsible for advocating for himself in such circumstances was absurd. But she had kept her voice level, had continued to present evidence and argue for interventions, had maintained the pretense that this was a problem that could be solved through proper channels and good faith efforts. Until the day she realized that her presence at the school was making things worse for Michael. Until she overheard a group of children talking about Michael's crazy mom and understood that her advocacy was being transformed into another weapon to use against her son. That was when she had begun to step back, to trust that the school would do what was right without her constant oversight. It was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, because it was during that period of reduced vigilance that everything fell apart. You said you remember my son, Sarah said, watching Principal Rodriguez's face for any sign of deception. But I don't remember you. And I remember everyone who was involved in Danny's case. Rodriguez smiled, but it was a sad expression, tinged with something that looked like regret. Memory is selective, Mrs. Chun. We remember what fits our understanding of events, and we forget what doesn't. Are you saying I'm remembering wrong? I'm saying that memory is reconstruction, not playback. Every time we remember something, we change it slightly. We add details that seem right, remove details that don't fit, adjust the emotional coloring to match our current understanding of what happened. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard variations of this speech before, from therapists and grief counselors and well-meaning friends who thought she was dwelling too much on the past. But hearing it from Principal Rodriguez, someone who claimed to have been there, to have witnessed the events she was struggling to remember correctly, felt different, threatening. So you're saying Danny wasn't bullied? That I imagined the whole thing. I'm saying that what happened to Danny was real, but your memory of what happened might not be entirely accurate. And that's not your fault, Mrs. Chun. It's how memory works, especially when we're trying to process trauma. Rodriguez opened the folder Sarah had placed on the desk, spreading out the contents with careful deliberation. Newspaper clippings, medical records, school incident reports. All the evidence Sarah had collected over the years. All the proof that her son's suffering had been real and documented and ignored by the people who should have protected him. But as Rodriguez examined the documents, her expression grew puzzled. Mrs. Chun, these dates, they don't match what you've been telling me. What do you mean? According to these records, Danny was a student here from 2008 to 2010. But you've been talking about incidents that supposedly happened over a much longer period. In this newspaper article, it's dated 2015, but it refers to events that allegedly took place in 2009. Sarah leaned forward, studying the documents that she had read countless times. The dates looked wrong, or rather, they looked different than she remembered them looking. The newspaper article that she had been certain was published shortly after Danny's death now appeared to be from years later, and the incident reports seemed to be describing events that had happened in a different order than she recalled. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Chun, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. When was the last time you saw Danny? The question hit her like a physical blow. Sarah's vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she might faint. The last time she had seen Danny. That was the question that haunted her dreams. The moment that everything had changed. The scene that she replayed endlessly in her mind, searching for signs she had missed, words she should have said, actions she should have taken. You know when? She whispered. You know what happened. I know what you think happened, but I'm not sure you do. Rodriguez pulled out another folder, one that Sarah hadn't seen before. It was thicker than the one she had brought, filled with documents that looked official and important. Medical records, psychiatric evaluations, court documents with letterheads that made Sarah's stomach clench with recognition. Mrs. Chen, according to these records, Danny didn't die in 2009. He didn't die at all. The words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through layers of cotton and confusion. Sarah shook her head, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. That can't be right. I have the death certificate. I was at the funeral. I spoke at the service. Mrs. Chen, you were hospitalized in 2009 following a severe psychological break. You spent 3 months in inpatient treatment and another year in intensive outpatient therapy. Danny was placed in temporary foster care during that time, and when you were released, the court determined that it would be in his best interest to remain in an alternative living situation. The room was spinning. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, trying to anchor herself to something solid, something real. But everything felt like it was dissolving around her, like the careful architecture of her memories was crumbling to reveal something else underneath, something that she couldn't bear to look at directly. No, she said firmly. No, that's not what happened. Danny was bullied. The school failed to protect him. He couldn't take it anymore. And he's alive, Mrs. Chen. Danny is alive. The words echoed in the small office like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of possibility and terror through Sarah's carefully constructed understanding of her own life. Danny is alive. 3 words that should have been a gift, a miracle, a reason for overwhelming joy. Instead, they felt like an accusation, a condemnation of the 15 years she had spent mourning a death that hadn't happened, building a shrine to a tragedy that existed only in her fractured memory. Rodriguez was watching her with the careful attention of someone trained to recognize the signs of psychological distress. Mrs. Chen, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You've been coming to this school for 3 years now, every 6 months or so. You always bring the same folder, always tell the same story, always ask the same questions. And every time, we have the same conversation. Sarah's hands were shaking. The folder on the desk seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its contents transforming from evidence of institutional failure to evidence of something far worse, evidence of her own dissolution, her own retreat from a reality too painful to bear. I don't remember coming here before. That's part of the condition, Mrs. Chen. The dissociative episodes. They allow you to forget the conversations that don't fit with the narrative you've created. Your mind is protecting you from information that contradicts the story you need to believe. Dissociative episodes. The clinical term landed like a diagnosis, heavy with implications that Sarah wasn't ready to explore. She had heard the phrase before. In therapy sessions she had chosen to forget. In medical consultations she had dismissed as irrelevant. I want to see him, she said suddenly, the words surprising her with their clarity. If Danny is alive, I want to see him. Rodriguez hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sarah glimpsed the full enormity of what she had lost. Not just her son, but her right to him. Not just his childhood, but her role in his life. Mrs. Chen, Danny is 25 years old now. He's an adult, living independently. He has a job, friends, a life that he's built for himself. He's thriving, but it took him years to recover from the trauma of what happened when he was a child. What trauma? The bullying. The trauma of having a mother who couldn't distinguish between reality and delusion. The trauma of being removed from his home because you had become a danger to yourself and, by extension, to him. The words were like bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. Sarah felt herself fragmenting, the careful boundaries between memory and imagination, between past and present, between what had happened and what she needed to have happened, dissolving entirely. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. The bullying you remember, Mrs. Chin, some of it was real. Danny did face challenges at school because of his autism. But most of what you remember never happened. The incidents you documented, the systematic harassment you reported, they were projections of your own fears, manifestations of your deteriorating mental health. Sarah tried to speak, but found that her voice had deserted her. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker in rhythm with her heartbeat, casting everything in a surreal, underwater glow. You became obsessed with the idea that the world was hostile to your son. Every interaction became evidence of persecution. Every difficulty became proof of discrimination. You documented imaginary incidents, confronted teachers about conversations that never took place, accused other children of cruelties they hadn't committed. No. The word formed in Sarah's mind but couldn't make it to her lips. No, that's not what happened. I was protecting him. I was being a good mother. But even as she protested internally, fragments of suppressed memory began to surface. The concerned looks from other parents. The careful way teachers spoke to her, as if she were made of glass and might shatter at any moment. The gradual isolation as her behavior became increasingly erratic, as her perception of threats became more acute and less grounded in reality. The final incident, Rodriguez continued gently, the one that led to your hospitalization. You were found in the school parking lot at 3 a.m, convinced that Danny was being held against his will inside the building. You had broken a window trying to get in. Danny was at home, safe in his bed, but you couldn't remember leaving him there. The memory came back in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered and forgotten. The cold October air. The crunch of broken glass under her feet. The security officer's voice, kind but firm, asking her to step away from the building. The confusion, the terrible disorientation of not knowing how she had gotten there or why she believed her son was in danger. And then, the hospital. The bright lights and soft voices. The medications that made her feel like she was swimming through syrup. The gradual, devastating realization that she had lost not just her grip on reality, but her son as well. "Where is he?" she whispered. "He lives about an hour from here. He works in IT for a non-profit organization. He has a girlfriend, a small circle of close friends who understand and appreciate his differences. He's happy, Mrs. Chin. Or as happy as someone can be when they've had to build their entire adult life around the absence of their mother." The words cut deep because they carried the weight of truth. Sarah could feel the careful structure of her delusions crumbling, revealing the devastation underneath. 15 years of her life, built on a foundation of false memories and manufactured grief. 15 years of her son's life, lived without her, without the love she had been so certain she was protecting him with. "Does he know I'm here? Does he know about these visits?" Rodriguez nodded slowly. "He knows. He's the one who authorized us to share this information with you. He's been hoping that eventually you might be ready to hear the truth. Does he want to see me?" The pause that followed was answer enough. Sarah closed her eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had lost, not through some external tragedy, not through institutional failure or societal cruelty, but through her own inability to hold on to reality when it became too difficult to bear. When Sarah opened her eyes, the office looked different again. Smaller, somehow, and more intimate. The harsh fluorescent lighting had been replaced by the warm glow of a desk lamp, and she realized that hours had passed while she grappled with the dissolution of everything she thought she knew about her own life. Principal Rodriguez had moved her chair closer, no longer the distant authority figure, but something more like a counselor, a guide through the wreckage of false memory and suppressed truth. "Mrs. Chin, I need to tell you something else. Something about why I've been having these conversations with you." Sarah looked up, surprised to find that she was no longer afraid of what she might hear. The worst had already been revealed. What remained was simply the work of picking up the pieces. "I knew Danny," Rodriguez said softly. "Not here, at this school. But later, when he was in high school. I was a social worker then, part of the team that helped him transition from foster care to independent living. The revelation should have been shocking, but instead it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Sarah had been right about the familiarity, the sense of recognition, but wrong about everything else. He was remarkable, Rodriguez continued. Brilliant, kind, determined to make something of himself despite everything he had been through. He spoke about you often, Mrs. Chin. Not with anger, but with love, and with sadness. He loves me. The words came out as a whisper, heavy with disbelief and desperate hope. He's never stopped loving you. But love and readiness for contact are different things. He needed time to heal, to build a life that was stable and secure. He needed to know that he could handle seeing you again without being pulled back into the chaos that defined his childhood. Sarah nodded, understanding flooding through her like a tide. And now he's ready. If you are. Rodriguez reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. An address, a phone number, and a brief note written in handwriting that Sarah recognized despite the 15 years that had passed since she had last seen it. Mom, I've been waiting for you to find your way back to the truth. When you're ready to meet the person I've become, instead of the child you remember, I'll be here. I love you. Danny. Sarah's hands shook as she held the note, reading it over and over, trying to absorb the reality of her son's continued existence, his growth, his capacity for forgiveness. The boy she remembered, the 10-year-old victim of her own fractured perception, had become a man without her, had survived not just the challenges of autism in an unforgiving world, but the trauma of losing his mother to mental illness. What happens now? She asked. Now you have a choice, Rodriguez said. You can continue to live in the past, to cling to the narrative of tragedy and loss that your mind created to protect you from a different kind of pain. Or you can step into the present, accept responsibility for what happened, and work toward building a relationship with your son based on who you both are now, rather than who you were 15 years ago. Sarah looked around the office one more time, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the scene of institutional failure she had imagined, but simply a place where a compassionate administrator had chosen to meet with a damaged woman, again and again, waiting for the moment when she might be ready to hear the truth. The bullying, she said. The incidents I remember. Were any of them real? Some of them, yes. Danny did face challenges because of his autism. Children could be cruel, and not all of his teachers understood his needs. But the systematic persecution you remember, the deliberate targeting, the school's indifference, those were projections of your own fears, amplified by your deteriorating mental state. Sarah nodded slowly. The truth was both better and worse than what she had remembered. Better because her son hadn't died, hadn't been driven to despair by unrelenting cruelty. Worse because she had been the source of his trauma, the danger he had needed protection from. Will you help me? She asked. To prepare for seeing him? I don't even know who I am anymore, let alone who he's become. Rodriguez smiled, and for the first time, it was an expression of genuine warmth rather than professional compassion. That's what therapy is for, Mrs. Chun. Real therapy, not the kind where you avoid difficult truths. It won't be easy, and there are no guarantees about what kind of relationship you and Danny will be able to build. But for the first time in 15 years, you're asking the right questions. Sarah stood up, leaving the folder of false evidence on the desk. She wouldn't need it anymore. The documentation of imaginary tragedies, the proof of crimes that existed only in her memory, all of it could stay here, in this office where truth and delusion had finally met and where truth had emerged victorious. As she reached the door, she turned back one final time. Principal Rodriguez, what's the M stand for? Miriam, she replied. But Danny always called me Ms. M. He said it was easier to remember. Sarah nodded, understanding. Even in that small detail, she could see her son's practical intelligence, his way of navigating a world that often felt overwhelmingly complex by finding simple solutions to everyday problems. She walked out of the school into the late afternoon sunlight, feeling disoriented but not lost. The world looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she was finally seeing it clearly. The parking lot where she had once believed her son was being held captive was just a parking lot. The building that had loomed in her memory as a fortress of indifference was just a school, filled with imperfect people doing their best to educate children. And somewhere, an hour's drive away, her son was living his life. Working, laughing, loving, existing in the present while she had been trapped in a past that had never really happened. Sarah got into her car and sat for a moment, holding Danny's note. Tomorrow, she would call the therapist Rodriguez had recommended. She would begin the real work of recovery, of building a foundation strong enough to support a relationship with the man her son had become. But today, she simply sat in the car and marveled at the miraculous ordinariness of the world around her. Children walking home from school, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, their voices carrying on the autumn air. Parents arriving to pick up stragglers from after-school programs. Teachers heading to their cars, tired but satisfied at the end of another day. All of it was real. All of it was happening in the present, not in the warped landscape of memory and trauma where she had been living for so long. And best of all, her son was real too. Not the tragic figure of her delusions, but a living, breathing adult who had survived his childhood, who had built a life for himself, who had never stopped loving the mother who had disappeared into her own mind when he needed her most. The fragility of memory, Sarah realized, was both a curse and a gift. It had allowed her to construct a version of events that protected her from unbearable guilt, but it had also prevented her from moving forward, from healing, from reconnecting with the person she had lost. Now, with the false memories finally dissolved, she could begin to build new ones. Real ones. Memories of reunion, of redemption, of a relationship rebuilt on truth rather than delusion. She started the car and drove home, carrying with her the weight of 15 lost years and the possibility of all the years yet to come. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, it was real. And that, Sarah thought as she watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood pass by, was enough to build a life on. The coffee shop Danny had chosen was small and unremarkable, the kind of place that served decent coffee without pretension. Sarah arrived early, partly from nervousness and partly from a lifetime habit of over-preparing for important events. She chose a table near the window, where she could watch the street while she waited. She had been in therapy for 6 months, working with Dr. Patterson. No relation to the former principal, just one of those coincidences that life occasionally offered. The work had been difficult, requiring her to dismantle not just the false memories of Danny's death, but the entire structure of victimhood and grievance that had supported her for so long. She had learned to distinguish between her fears and reality, between protection and paranoia. She had come to understand that her love for Danny, however misguided in its expression, had been real and powerful enough to survive 15 years of separation. When Danny walked into the coffee shop, Sarah recognized him immediately, despite the changes that 15 years had wrought. He was tall now, with the same dark hair and intelligent eyes, but his face had lost the soft roundness of childhood and gained the angular definition of adulthood. He moved with confidence, the awkward gait of his youth replaced by purposeful strides. He spotted her and smiled, not the huge, unguarded smile of the boy she remembered, but something more measured, more careful. The smile of someone who had learned to protect himself from disappointment. "Hi, Mom," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Hi, Danny." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 15 years settling between them like an uninvited guest. Sarah studied her son's face, searching for traces of the boy she had lost, marveling at the man he had become without her guidance. "You look good," she said finally, meaning it. There was a steadiness about him, a groundedness that spoke of hard-won peace. "Thank you. So do you." Danny's voice was deeper than she remembered, but it carried the same careful precision that had characterized his speech as a child. "Ms. Rodriguez said you've been doing well in therapy." Sarah nodded. "It's been illuminating and difficult. I'm sorry, Danny, for everything. For the years I lost, for the childhood I stole from you, for..." "Mom." The word stopped her mid-sentence. "We don't have to do this all at once. I didn't come here for apologies." I came here because I wanted to see you, because I wanted to know if we could find a way forward." The simple pragmatism of his response was so quintessentially Danny that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. He had always been a problem solver, more interested in solutions than blame. "Tell me about your life," she said. "Your job, your girlfriend. Ms. Rodriguez mentioned you're happy." Danny's face softened slightly. "I am. It took time, and it wasn't easy. But yes, I'm happy. I work for a nonprofit that develops assistive technology for people with disabilities. It's good work, meaningful work. And Maya, my girlfriend, she's a teacher. She works with autistic kids, actually." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Her son had found love with someone who understood and served children like he had been. "Does she know? About me? About what happened?" "She knows everything. Maya's the one who encouraged me to reach out, to give this a chance." Danny paused, studying Sarah's face. She said something that stuck with me. She said that understanding mental illness doesn't make its effects less painful, but it can make forgiveness possible. Sarah absorbed this, recognizing the gift she was being offered. Not absolution, that would have to be earned, but the possibility of redemption, of relationship built on truth rather than the comfortable lies of memory. "What do you remember?" she asked. "About your childhood? About what happened?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the table surface in a gesture that was achingly familiar. "I remember being confused a lot. I remember you being scared all the time, jumping at shadows, seeing threats that weren't there. I remember the night they took me away, how you fought them, how convinced you were that they were the danger, not—" He trailed off. "Not me," Sarah finished quietly. "I understood later that you were sick, that your mind was trying to protect me in the only way it knew how, even when that protection became the thing I needed protecting from. I spent years angry about it, years in therapy working through the damage. But I never stopped loving you, Mom, even when I couldn't remember exactly why." The words were like balm on a wound Sarah had carried for 15 years. She reached across the table, stopping just short of Danny's hand. "May I?" He nodded, and she covered his hand with hers. His skin was warm, real, solid, proof that this moment was happening in the present, not in the reconstructed landscape of memory. "I want to know everything," she said. "About who you've become, about the life you've built. But I also want you to know that I understand if this is all we can have. This conversation, this connection. I don't expect to reclaim a place in your life that I forfeited a long time ago." Danny turned his hand over, palm up, and squeezed her fingers. "That's up to us to figure out, isn't it? Neither of us is the same person we were 15 years ago. Maybe that's not such a bad thing." They talked for 2 hours, filling in the gaps with small details and larger truths. Danny told her about his struggles in foster care, his determination to succeed academically, his journey towards self-acceptance and independence. Sarah shared her own journey, the long years of therapy, the gradual dissolution of false memories, the painful but necessary work of learning to live in reality rather than in the protective fortress her mind had constructed. When they finally parted ways, it was with a tentative plan to meet again in 2 weeks. No grand gestures, no promises of instant reconciliation. Just two people, related by blood and separated by trauma, choosing to take small steps toward understanding. As Sarah drove home, she thought about memory and its deceptions. For 15 years, she had been haunted by the ghost of a son who had never died, tormented by guilt over a tragedy that had never occurred. The real tragedy, her own mental breakdown and its impact on her child, had been too painful to acknowledge, so her mind had created an alternative narrative, one where she was the hero rather than the cause of her son's suffering. But memory, she now understood, was not just about the past. It was also about the future, about the experiences yet to be accumulated, the relationships yet to be built. She and Danny would never recover the years they had lost. The boy he had been and the mother she had been were gone forever, casualties of illness and time. What remained was possibility. The possibility of knowing the man her son had become. The possibility of contributing, however modestly, to his ongoing happiness. The possibility of building new memories, real ones this time, that might help to balance the weight of all that had been lost. The fragility of memory, Sarah realized, was not just a source of pain but also a source of hope. If memories could be false, they could also be created. If the past could be misremembered, the future could be written anew. She pulled into her driveway as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. But she had learned to trust her senses again, to believe in the evidence of the present moment rather than the distortions of recollection. The evening air was cool against her skin. The sound of children playing in a nearby yard was clear and immediate. The scent of someone's barbecue drifted on the breeze, mixing with the earthy smell of autumn leaves. All of it was real. All of it was happening now, in this moment, in this life that she was finally ready to inhabit fully. Sarah walked to her front door, fishing for her keys with hands that no longer shook with the weight of suppressed truth. Tomorrow, she would call Dr. Patterson and tell her about the meeting with Danny. Next week, she would meet with Danny again, taking another small step toward whatever relationship they might be able to build. But tonight, she would simply be present in her own life, grateful for the gift of reality and the possibility of redemption that it offered. The past was irretrievable, its truths and falsehoods finally sorted and understood. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and opportunities in equal measure. What mattered was the present moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this small but profound victory of choosing truth over comfortable delusion, reality over the seductive shelter of false memory. Sarah opened her door and stepped into her house, leaving behind the ghost of the son who had never died and welcoming the possibility of knowing the man he had become. It was not the ending she had written in her mind 15 years ago, but it was something better. It was real. And in the end, she thought as she turned on the lights and began to prepare dinner for one, reality, however imperfect, however painful, was the only foundation solid enough to build a life upon. Memory might be fragile, but truth endured. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, truth was enough to set you free.